Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to chapter 6 of our Understanding International Relations lectures. We will have a look today at transnationalism, a specific approach called transnationalism, somehow forgotten or neglected or ignored in the contemporary American handbooks or textbooks. Why? Probably because transnationalism, sometimes called sociological liberalism or interdependence liberalism, is a subsumed in the neoliberal approach that had the neo debate with the neo-realists in the 1980s, and that we will have a look at in our chapter 8. Anyway, I consider transnationalism to be an approach which deserves to be studied as such. It emerged the very end of the 60s. It was somehow successful, notably during the 70s, before re-emerging at the end of the Cold War and during the 90s. It emerged at the end of the period which the French call Trente Glorieuses. The expression is due to the French economist Jean Fourastier. Trente Glorieuses corresponds to what is considered to be the kind of economic miracle that permitted the Western European societies to reach the mass consumption level that we now know in our societies. The 30 years going roughly from the Marshall Plan to the midst of the 70s, when this period of growth, of mass consumption, of welfare, of social security, etc., started being threatened by two major crises. We will come back to them: the monetary crisis and the oil crisis of 1973, 1974. Anyway, the background is important as usual in my approach. Why? Because just as Marxism had been favored by the background of the rise of the Third World, so transnationalism, the rise of transnationalism, the emergence of transnationalism will be favored by this background, which is different from the one which realists emphasize when claiming that during these 3 decades, the Cold War bipolar confrontation was the most important international process. Anyway, let's very quickly sum up what we saw last week. We saw that neo-Marxism challenged the prevailing realist approach, first by claiming that social classes rather than states are the most important actors. Social classes, bourgeois or capitalists on the one hand, proletarians on the other hand in today's world. And neo-Marxism also challenged realism, because neo-Marxism was interested in studying the dependence of the core, of the periphery from the core, in notably the economic domain, rather than studying the military, political, strategic rivalry opposing the East and West or the US to the USSR. Neo-Marxism then was not the only grand theory to challenge realism in the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. Transnationalism too challenged realism, and does emerge during this period what has been called, at least in Europe, the third debate, or the inter-paradigmatic debate, a kind of triangular dispute, a kind of triangular dialogue to opposing state-centric realists to non-state-centric non-realists. The state-centric realists claim that states are the only significant actors, and that the discipline of international relations should focus on diplomatic, strategic interactions in the domain of war and peace, what they consider to be high politics as opposed to low politics. And this realist approach then is rejected by non-state-centric, non-realists who claim that there are other actors than states, and who claim that the non-political, non-strategic, non-military domains are potentially as important as the narrow international political domain, and these non-state-centric, non-realists then themselves can be divided into the neo-Marxists, we saw them last week, and into the transnationalists, whom we will have a look at nowadays. The main claims of the transnationalists consist in saying that non-state actors are as important as the states, and they claim that what we have to look at is not relations among independent states, nor the dependence in the economic domain of the periphery from the core, but what we should look at, the most important process, is interdependence among societies. So not independent states, not dependent peripheries from the core, but interdependent societies. The idea of interdependence, ladies and gentlemen, had been put forward as early as during the interwar periods, even during World War I, by the interwar idealists, the British idealists, whom we saw in our chapter 2. Listen, for instance, to one of them, Leonard Woolf. In 1916, this is what he wrote, I quote, "The world is closely knit together. We are linked to our neighbor by the gold and silver wires of commerce and finance, not to mention the telephone wires, steel rays, and therefore the ordinary conception of the isolated independent states, the independent, sovereign, separate state, this ordinary conception, according to Leonard Woolf, is inadequate. It is inadequate. So if then independence is no longer the most important characteristic, then interdependence is the most important characteristic. And this is what will be claimed a bit later in 1933 by Ramsay Muir. Listen to him. "We have entered a new era, the era of interdependence. And the world now takes the form of one single marketplace." The idea of interdependence put forward by idealists during the interwar period, however, was forgotten during one or two generations. Why? Because we saw this in our chapter 2, because idealism was refuted, or the idealist outlook was refuted by the outbreak of the Great Depression, the rise of totalitarian regimes, the outbreak, for example, most of World War II, and then of the Cold War. Realism prevailed, and realism came back to states are independent, etc., etc. So this idea of interdependence somehow was forgotten in the discipline of international relations, I mean, of course, and things began to change from the end of the 60s onwards. Why? As usual, because some processes, some events took place, which were as many anomalies for the realist approach, that is to say, which could not be accounted for on the basis of the realists' state-centric assumptions. First of all, at the end of the Trente Glorieuses, of this economic miracle that lasted some 30 years, two important crises occurred, and to some extent, they were the most important international events, though not being a political or strategic or military events. The monetary crisis of 1971, when Richard Nixon decided to put an end to the Bretton Woods system that had been established in 1945, and the oil crisis of 1973, after the price of oil was multiplied by 4 due to the initiative both of the oil exporting countries of the Middle East, but also due to the initiative of notably the American majors, the American multinational oil firms. If then economic events were very important, then the realist assumption according to which the strategic political domain is more important than anything else somehow is put into question, given the importance of these crises due to in the domain of energy and in the domain of international money. A second process occurred at the very beginning of the 70s, the end of the 60s, the beginning of the 70s. In Chile, a coup occurred. Salvador Allende, the socialist president who had been democratically elected, his government was overthrown during a coup staged by a Chilean general, Augusto Pinochet. However, also due to the interference of the American CIA, not the US as such, as a state, the US national government, the CIA, but also an American multinational firm, ITT, International Telephone and Telegraph. Why? Because the socialist government of Allende had nationalized various industries, notably the copper industry, that was important for the International Telephone and Telegraph Company. Here then we have an example of a private actor, a multinational firm, plus a non-official CIA, non-state actors, in other words, able to overthrow a government supposed to control a sovereign state. Obviously, once again, the realist assumption of sovereignty and of states being the most important actors is somehow refuted. And last but not least, even in the domain, which is the core of the realist approach, that is the domain, that is to say, the domain of war and peace, realism was challenged because of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was lost by America. It was lost for different reasons, but one of the reasons contributing to the decision of America to withdraw was the fact that within America, many anti-war protests occurred. To put it differently, on the one hand, the American military superpower was unable to defeat the communist guerrilla in Vietnam. So military strength, to some extent, is no more that useful, at least to systematically prevail over somebody else. So there is a kind of obsolescence of the utility of military force, military strength. And on the other hand, if America decided to withdraw from Vietnam also because of domestic anti-war protests, then there is no more radical separation of the international domain from the domestic political scene, which amounts to saying that we should no longer assume, as realists do, that international politics, by definition, as such, is different from and separated from the domestic political stage. So these evolutions, ladies and gentlemen, which realism, which contradicted, refuted, belied, or at least challenged realism, were taken into account by a new generation of scholars who emphasized precisely the limits of liberalism. And the first among them, who deserves to be mentioned, is a German scholar, Karl Kaiser. Karl Kaiser, who in 1969 published an article, Transnational Politics was the title, and the subtitle, Towards a Theory of Multinational Politics, Transnational Politics. Here then we have the concept of transnationalism introduced in the discipline by the German Karl Kaiser. In this article, what did Karl Kaiser do? Well, he started rejecting the relevance of continuing to use the term international politics or even international relations. Listen to Karl Kaiser. The concept of international politics, which is central in the then discipline, is increasingly called into question. if the concept of international politics is valid at all, if we should go on using it, it is valid only understood as an ideal type. That is to say, we should use it when focusing on some essential characteristics of international relations. The field of action of politics lying in the era between states, among inter-states, and precisely the fact that the actors concerned are states. Now, according to interstate politics, international politics, interstate politics, now according to Karl Kaiser, well, there are more and more processes which precisely do no longer concern states, and therefore that no longer take place in the space among inter-states. These processes, I go on quoting, include direct, horizontal transactions between societal actors, no more state actors, but societal actors belonging to different nation states, but they have direct relations, interactions with one another. That is to say, I quote, growing activities of a number of non-state actors, which bypass the institutions of government and yet strongly affect the margin of maneuver of these governments. And the set of these interactions due to non-state actors bypassing the official governments of nation states, the set of these interactions form a transnational society, are constitutive of transnational relations. Transnational relations then are a set of interactions in a specific issue era between societal actors belonging to different national systems, such as the examples he give were examples of then important non-state actors, the Roman Catholic Church, multinational corporations, which emerged at the end of the 60s. You may know that the first American multinational corporations that emerged in the 1960s were an indirect consequence of the European common market. Why? Because the American multinational firms came to the conclusion that they had an interest no longer in exporting the goods that they produced in the US to the different European countries. They had an interest in establishing their industrial plants directly in one European country, because this permitted them to sell them on the whole European common market, since there were no more customs between the different European member states of the then European community. McDonald's, ladies and gentlemen, opened its first restaurant in Canada, outside the US in Canada in 1967, and then immediately in different European states. So multinational firms, the Roman Catholic Church, Roman multinational corporations, and non-governmental organizations. Amnesty International, ladies and gentlemen, was founded in 1961. Greenpeace will be founded in 71, that is to say 2 years after Karl Kaiser's article. Médecins Sans Frontières, the French doctors, the so-called French doctors. Also, this NGO was created in 1971 too. So Kaiser's landmark article, ladies and gentlemen, is at the origin of the transnationalist approach in the discipline of international relations, claiming, I quote the definition of Thomas Risse, also a German scholar but belonging to a future generation, transnational relations are regular interactions across national boundaries initiated by at least one actor, which is not a state actor, which does not operate on behalf of a national government or an intergovernmental organization. Please make no mistake, do not confuse non-governmental and intergovernmental organizations. A non-governmental organization, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, etc., is a non-state actor. An intergovernmental organization or an international organization, the UN, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, etc., is not a known and is not a non-state actor. It is an interstate actor because the states are represented by their governments, their administrations, ambassadors in the different organizations concern. Within the discipline of international relations, then, this transnationalist approach founded by Kaiser in the discipline of international relations, it gradually was deepened, revisited, and put forward in the United States of America by Robert Keohane and Joseph Nye. Roughly at the same time, beginning of the 70s, in the United Kingdom by an Australian author, John Burton. And one generation later, once again in the US, by a new American, another American author who had been a behaviorist during the first part of his career, but who became a transnationalist theorist, James Rosenau, at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. So 3 sections in my summary of this transnationalist approach, and we will start immediately with Robert Keohane and Joseph Nye. Robert Keohane and Joseph Nye had started their academic career with a PhD dissertation on European regional integration, or on regional integration in general, which was somehow very successful in the US at the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s, because of the European integration process, of course. But the author at the origin of regional integration theory, the American Ernst Haas, himself in the midst of the 60s had ended up rejecting his own approach. That is to say, regional studies were no more that successful. And this is the reason why Robert Keohane and Joseph Nye abandoned their own research project on regional integration immediately after having finished their PhD dissertation, and they were looking for a new approach, likely, of course, to criticize the still prevailing realist approach. And so they thought of this new approach called transnationalism by Kaiser. What did they do? Well, they launched a workshop entitled Transnational Relations and World Politics. They invited Kaiser to give a lecture during this workshop, and they published all the different contributions to this workshop in a special issue of the journal International Organization, an academic journal of the discipline of IR, before it became an edited book. You see it on the left of the slide. This workshop, dealing with transnational relations and world politics, somehow made a new revisited presentation of Kaiser's article. According to Keohane and Nye, who wrote the introduction and the summary of this special issue of this book, according to Keohane and Nye, there are in today's world 4 types of global interactions which are due to non-state actors. A communication, that is to say, the movement of information, of news, of ideas or ideologies, of doctrines, etc. Transportation, the movement of goods, of products. We could say trade, of course, commerce. Finance is the third global interaction, the movement of money, the movement of instruments of credit, and travel, of course, the movement of persons, be they migrants, refugees, tourists, students, drug dealers, etc. Businessmen. These global interactions, ladies and gentlemen, these global interactions concerning the movement of tangible and intangible items are initiated and sustained by non-governmental actors, be these actors individuals, students, tourists, or collective groups, of course, organizations, non-government organizations, economic firms, or networks. At that time, not yet terrorist networks, but other kind of networks. Nowadays, terrorist networks, of course, belong to non-state actors. And due to the rise, the growing importance of these non-state actors and their direct interactions, well, the state-centric, that is to say, the realist approach, paradigm theory, must be replaced, or at least supplemented by a new approach, in terms of world politics, no more international politics. And this is the reason why they used it in the title of the book publishing the lectures of the workshop. A new approach in terms of world politics, and whose aim is to do what? Well, to study the reciprocal effects between transnational relations and the interstate system. We can no longer study the traditional interstate or international political system without also studying the transnational relations of non-state actors and the reciprocal effect of these two kinds of interactions. Very concretely, Keohane and Nye undertook this study in a second book, published in 1977, Power, Interdependence. Other editions, of course, were published later on. This is the fourth edition that you see on the slide. The first edition was published in 1977, Power and Independence. And in this book, they coined an expression which became very famous in the discipline, complex interdependence, complex interdependence. This concept was hinged upon three major assumptions, hypotheses. According to Keohane and Nye, we can no longer focus on states exclusively. Why? Because there are three types of actors: state actors, traditional states; sub-state actors, that is to say, members of administrations having direct relations with members of other administrations without necessarily respecting the hierarchy within the administration. This somehow recalls Allison's bureaucracies, or Allison's organizational administration, the different agencies within an administration. An administration in America is the government. So state actors, sub-state actors, and non-state actors, that is to say societal or private actors, and they initiate logically three kinds of interactions: interstate relations, the traditional international political interactions focused on by realists; transgovernmental relations due to sub-state actors; and transnational relations, the ones emphasized notably by Kaiser and by themselves in the beginning of the 70s. Second basic assumption of this complex interdependence model: the end of the Bretton Woods system, that is to say, the monetary crisis of 71 and the oil crisis of 73 have shown, according to Keohane and Nye, that there is no more separation between the political strategic domain and the non-political, economic, energetic, etc. domain. There is no more separation and there is no more hierarchy. That is to say, we can no more claim that international politics is high politics, whereas economic, etc. domains are low politics. Why? Well, the reason is the following one. Ladies and gentlemen, why did Nixon decide to put an end in 71 to the Bretton Woods system? Because he considered the rise of the European and Japanese economies as a threat to America's preeminence. That is to say, an economic process, the rise, the growth of European economies was perceived as a threat to America's global preeminence, not merely in the economic, but also in the political domain. So there is no more strict separation between economy and politics. And this was all the more so true in 1973 when the oil crisis broke out. The oil crisis broke out as a consequence of a political event, a very concrete, a strategic, political, diplomatic event, the Kippur or October War of 1973, opposing Israel to the Arab states of Egypt and Syria. And the Arab oil producing and oil exporting countries decided to increase the price of the oil that they sold to the rest of the world in a kind of solidarity with Egypt and with Syria. That is to say, a political event was at the origin of an economic decision, which had then an impact on the whole political, the world political stage, or the world stage, international stage, all at once economic and political. No more separation between economy and politics, no more hierarchy. The oil crisis, though not being directly a political event, was a significant event. And according to Keohane and Nye, the third assumption of their complex interdependence model consists in saying that in today's world, military power is gradually obsolescent. The immediate origin of this claim was America's defeat in the Vietnam War. Despite being a military superpower, the US was not able to defeat the communist guerrilla. And they drew then the general conclusion that in today's interdependent world, well, military power is not that longer so useful as it used to be in the past. Why? Well, because since we are interdependent, we can no longer resort to military force in order to impose our will. Power in an interdependent world, and therefore the title Power and Interdependence of their book, power in an interdependent world is no longer synonymous with the capacity to impose one's will, but it is more close to the capacity to adapt to the new interdependent world, where precisely non-state actors are more and more important. Which also means that a state, powerful in one domain, is not necessarily powerful in another domain. You can use no military force to prevent Arab states from increasing the price of the oil. Military strength is not relevant in this issue. So you must become aware as a state that power is no longer what it used to be. It is now the capacity to adapt in a world where interdependence permits other actors to be powerful in other domains. To sum up, ladies and gentlemen, Keohane and Nye depicted an image of world politics much more complex than the realist one, focusing only on strategic domain, but also much richer than the idealist conception of interdependence that I reminded some minutes ago. At first sight, by claiming that military strength is no longer that useful, does not always permit to obtain satisfaction. At first sight, this claim is very close to the optimistic idealist outlook of the interwar period, claiming that peace will prevail thanks to economic interdependence. At first sight, because the conception of interdependence put forward by Keohane and Nye precisely is complex. That is to say, interdependence also means vulnerability. If you need oil, which is produced, extracted somewhere else than in your own country, well, the interdependence of the world economy is synonymous also of vulnerability. That is to say that interdependence also restricts autonomy. It is not merely synonymous with enrichment of all the partners concerned. So they proposed a picture of world politics not necessarily synonymous with a never-ending state of war, but not either synonymous with a kind of a rosy future of cooperation among interdependent actors, as somehow put forward by interwar idealists, coining the expression of interdependence. To put it differently, Keohane and Nye emphasized what we may call the dark side of interdependence. That is to say, they were interested in studying how interdependence affected interstate politics in general, and first and foremost, the capacity of the United States to go on remaining the preeminent power in a world where America's military strength was no longer systematically useful. To some extent, they might have called their book Power Within Interdependence, or US Power Within Interdependence, much more than power and interdependence. What they were interested in was to study the contamination of interstate politics and first and foremost of American foreign policy by transnational relations, which also amounts to saying that at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, they gradually abandoned the transnationalist approach. They abandoned the transnationalist approach. They were no longer interested in deepening the research program which they had privileged during the 1970s. What did Keohane do, ladies and gentlemen? He, in 1984, published his most important book after Hegemony. The book is part of the so-called neo debate, the debate opposing neoliberals. Keohane became a neoliberal or neoliberal institutionalist, two neo-realists in the domain of cooperation. We will see this in chapter 8. Regarding Joseph Nye, he ended up in the 1980s, at the very end of the 1980s, and more specifically in 1990, he ended up coining the concept of soft power, which became a very successful term, not merely in the discipline of international relations, but to some extent also, and all the more so, in political circles of decision makers, of policy makers, of experts. Soft power, ladies and gentlemen, is a term which is pretty often used nowadays, so 30 years after having been coined by Joseph Nye. And I would like to emphasize the fact that those who nowadays use it forget the original meaning of the term. So a somehow important remark, also to emphasize what I consider to be the difference between academic language and everyday or common sense or political discourse. Joseph Nye coins the expression soft power in a book, Bounded to Lead, also in an article published in the Foreign Policy, the magazine, in 1990. Why did he coin this concept? He coined this concept of soft power in order to counter another book published in 1988 by the British historian Paul Kennedy, a British historian, but professor at Yale University in the US. And in this book called The Rise and Decline of the Major Powers, the Great Powers, Paul Kennedy had announced the decline of the US in a more or less faraway future. Why? Because, being a British, he established a comparison, a parallel between British decline in the beginning of the 20th century, at the eve of World War I, and the future decline of the US. This is the so-called power cycle theory. We'll see it in our very last chapter 11 more specifically. The power cycle theory claims that there are regular hegemonic powers that emerge and that dominate the world before they decline. So this happened to the UK. It also happened to some extent to France before the UK, to Spain before France, and it will happen in the future for the US. This prediction, of course, was perceived in the US as bad news. And so Joseph Nye looked for an argument likely to counter this analysis. And he came to the following conclusion: we cannot compare America's power in the 1980s, in the 1990s, at the end of the 19th century, to Great Britain's power 100 years earlier. Why? Because nowadays, the non-material power, which he called the soft power, is more important than the material power, basically military strength, but also economic power. So here then we have the origin of the term soft power. What then does soft power consist in? Well, it consists in the capacity to seduce, to attract, to co-opt other states. Thanks to what? Well, thanks to the self-image of a state due to the values, the ideas, the culture, the products that are themselves due to the civil society, to private actors. America's soft power, ladies and gentlemen, according to Nye, is first and foremost Hollywood, American cars, American jeans and other brands, American movies, American laptops, American software, etc., etc. This is what seduces us in America. Now, it emanates from civil actors, from private actors, from private initiatives. That is to say that soft power is not implemented consciously by governments. Therefore, to talk of Chinese soft power or of Russian soft power is somehow nonsense. At least if we stick to the original definition of soft power by Joseph Nye. Of course, given the success of his term, he himself no longer sticks to this original definition. And this is all the more so the case of those who use the term in everyday language. French soft power, if it exists, refers to a French cuisine, to French La Nouvelle Vague, the movies, the 60s, to the French chanson, to the French kiss, maybe, but not to what the French governments consciously put into practice or implement. And there can be no Chinese soft power, ladies and gentlemen, because there is no free Chinese civil society, nor is there no free Russian civil society. So you should not confound soft power with non-material diplomacy. Of course, cultural diplomacy exists. Chinese cultural diplomacy exists, but it's not soft power, strictly speaking. Okay, so the term soft power is a liberal and actually a transnationalist concept. And therefore, governments are not concerned to some extent. We should know that if we accept to remain conceptually rigorous, which should be the case in an academic setting, I emphasize, in an academic setting. Anyway, Keohane and Nye gradually abandoned the transnationalist approach, which means that we may consider another or other authors as being the genuine, I would say, theorists of transnationalism in the discipline of international relations. And I would say that the first one here is not an American, but an Australian scholar, John Burton, who was teaching in British universities. His book, World Society, was published in 1974, so a bit later than 1971, but if we go back to Keohane and Nye, but earlier than the complex interdependence thesis that was published in 1977. So the term World Society, the title of the book, is in itself important. Burton is not interested in world politics, as was the case of Keohane and Nye, and look at their title, Transnational Relations and World Politics. He's interested in world society, that is to say, he claims that there is a world society divided among states. So it's somehow the reversed perspective, the reversed hierarchy. Keohane and Nye claim that there is an international political scene more and more affected by transnational relations. John Burton claims that there is a world society still divided among separate political units. But what he is interested in is in studying the world society, that is to say, the set of needs of what he calls the human race. The set of needs and aspirations of the human race. So his approach is directly, straight away transnational, and maybe should I even say cosmopolitan, much more than somehow liberal. Burton claims that in this world society, communications, once again, communications of all kinds and not power, are the most important organizing influence in this world society. Communications of all kinds, ladies and gentlemen, I quote, become quicker. There was no internet yet at that time, and more frequent between different geographical points. And then he says, look at the quotes on the bottom of the slide, there is one world of science, of ideas, of trade, of commerce. And this one world is only marginally affected by the barriers, be they physical barriers such as mountains and seas, or artificial political barriers such as boundaries of states, such as state borders. So you see here the reversed hierarchy. To some extent, Burton, by focusing on communications, updates an idea that had been put forward by a student of communication as early as in the end of the 1960s, beginning of the 70s, the Canadian Marshall McLuhan, with his idea of a global village. A global village exists, a world society. The idea is perfectly similar. This world society then, Burton is eager to depict it thanks to a new model, which he will call the cobweb model, the spider web model, as opposed to the billiard ball model. The billiard ball model, ladies and gentlemen, was a picture proposed by Albert Wolfers, the realist whom we already saw in our chapter 4, he who had proposed the metaphor of the burning house. He also proposed in the same book, Discord and Collaboration, he had proposed a picture of international politics by using the metaphor of the billiard ball. What happens on the pool table, ladies and gentlemen? On the pool table, we have different balls of different size, of different color, etc. They move on the billiard ball, and by definition, the heavier one, the bigger one, pushes the other one away. And the contacts between billiard balls on the pool table only occur on the surface of the balls. Nothing happens within the balls. This was the metaphor used by Wolfers in order to depict international politics. The bigger states, just as the bigger balls, impose their will upon the smaller states. And the states' interactions only concern their governments, their ambassadors, but not the societies, that is, say, what happens within states or within the balls in the metaphor. Now, precisely, according to Burton, this model, this billiard ball model, should be abandoned. A new one should be proposed. He will call it the cobweb model. The cobweb model, on the button on the right, a part of the slide, the cobweb model, the spiderweb model, permits first to see that there are different kinds of interactions, states, non-states, economic, political, etc., just as there are different threads on the spiderweb. These interactions crisscross domestic societies. They do not stop at the border. So there are contexts from the outside, within the inside, and vice versa, as opposed to the billiard ball model. And you know what happens on the spider web when, for instance, a fly hits the spider web. The spider, even if it is on the other side of the spider web, knows that the fly hit the spider web because the impact on a specific point will have an impact everywhere on the spider web. And it is this idea precisely which is at the core of Burton's cobweb model. Not merely there is no more separation between the domestic political scene or domestic social scene and the world societal scene. This was an idea. This is an idea that Keohane and Nye, to some extent, also, and Kaiser had put already forward. But what is innovative in the cobweb model is the idea consisting in claiming that due to increased interdependence, a change somewhere, an event somewhere, a process anywhere leads to a change, provokes an event, entails a process, prospectively everywhere else. That is to say, local events are likely to have global consequences. And events occurring far away will have an impact locally. John Burton, therefore, anticipated what some 10 to 12 to 15 years later, in the second half of the 80s, will be called globalization. What is globalization? Here you will find some possible definitions. The one of Marshall McLuhan, though he did not use the term globalization, he used the term global village. The one of the German sociologist Peter Sloterdijk, the coming together of the world as a world. Anthony Giddens, the British sociologist, exactly the same idea that I summed up 2 minutes ago. The intensification of worldwide social relations is such that local happenings are shaped by events occurring many miles away, and vice versa. David Hell's worldwide interconnectedness, Ulrich Beck, sovereign national states are crisscrossed and undermined by a transnational act. Globalization, the term will be successful from the mid of the 1980s onwards, and the mid of the 1980s onwards is the background of the third major author within the transnational approach, the most recent one, James Rosenau, who proposed in 1990, his so-called turbulence model, also called the post-international. So he does not use the term transnational, he used the term post-international, which somehow is synonymous. And what's more, Rosenau added a new element, the importance of individuals as direct actors on the post-international scene, in the world, a society. Individuals as direct actors, whereas Kaiser, also Keohane and Nye, and even to some extent Burton, focused on on collective non-state actors, firms, networks, NGOs, but not individuals. The fact that some specific individuals, prospectively, such as you and me, may become post-international actors is the contribution of James Rosenau to the scientific study of international relations. The book, Turbulence in World Politics, was published in 1990. That is to say, 1 year after, at the end of the Cold War. So you have a picture on the cover page of the book, the picture on top of the page, on the cover, you see German citizens from East and West Berlin on the Brandenburger Tor after they destroyed the Berlin Wall, thus putting an end to the German division, thus permitting the German reunification and the end of the Cold War. You also see on the bottom of the cover the tanks of the Chinese Popular Army stopped by a Chinese activist during the spring of Beijing of May 1989, so some months before the Berlin Wall came down. The Chinese activist or dissident Wang Weilin, who stopped during some seconds these tanks. We do not know what happened to him. I at least do not know what happened to him. These two pictures perfectly sum up the rise of individual actors, able by their initiatives to change the world. They have an impact, at least as important as states embodied in their statesmen as claimed by realists. That said, though the book was published, we'll come back to these individuals. Though the book was published in 1990, that is to say, in a period synonymous with the end of the Cold War, and as such, synonymous with a kind of generalized conviction, hope that peace would prevail in the post-Cold War world. Despite this context, Rosenau's post-international approach is anything but naively optimistic. Actually, the opposite is true. Why? Because Rosenau definitely abandons the somehow optimistic outlook that was underlying Kaiser's, Burton's, and even somehow Keohane and Nye's transnational approach. The implicit teleological dimension of a world moving towards peace and prosperity. Why? Because he had, as early as in 1980, wrote a book called The Study of Global Interdependence. The term global appeared. And within this book, one chapter was called The Tourist and the Terrorist. The Tourist and the Terrorist. That is to say, Rosenau, as early as 1980, emphasized the fact that globalization, interdependence, was embodied both by tourists, kind of sympathetic side of globalization. We can travel around the world to see beautiful landscapes and cities, etc. But it is also embodied by the terrorists, which is somehow the dark side of globalization, interdependence. Terrorists too travel from one state to another to undertake their attacks. To put it differently, the contemporary world will go towards turbulent times. And turbulence means a kind of chaotic, unpredictable future. Expect our world, not the rosy future of peace and prosperity. So the starting claim of James Rosenau's approach, it consisted in saying that various somehow radical changes took place during the 70s, the 80s, unknown variations, novel fluctuations, these are the terms that he used, such as the transition from industrial to post-industrial or postmodern societies, the emergence of global commons, nowadays climate change, of course, unlikely to be managed at the state level, the progressive incapacity, according to him, of national governments to satisfy the needs of their own citizens. And these somehow systemic changes, according to James Rosenau, had impacts upon what he calls the parameters of the post-international system. The parameters. And he distinguishes, we could say, 3 levels. He distinguished 3 such parameters: the micro-political parameter, also called the individual one, relative to average people's political skills. The macro political parameter, also called the systemic or structural level, relative to the system-wide structure of the international system, which is a post-international one. And between the two, the micro-macro parameter, also called the relational parameter, relative to allegiance or loyalty or authority links between the individual or the individuals and the collective group to which they belong, the state, but not merely the state. We'll come back to this. Concretely then, which changes occurred at the first level, the first parameter, the micro political or individual parameter? According to Rosenau, a kind of silent revolution took place regarding the political skills of average citizens, not statesmen or politicians, but average citizens such as you and me. In the realist approach, ladies and gentlemen, average citizens are, I'm sorry, stupid. Ignorant of what international politics is all about. Ignorant because indifferent. Indifferent because not interested. Not interested because not concerned. According to realists, average citizens within a country are not concerned by what happens beyond the borders, because what is happening beyond the borders is dealt with by their government. So they are not directly impacted by foreign policy and international political events. So since they are not affected, they are not interested in knowing what happens, they are indifferent, and therefore, well, they have no somehow credible opinion or conviction or analysis of what international politics is consisting in. And when they react according to their mood. This is the so-called mood theory. It goes back to Machiavelli, it goes back to Tocqueville and general political thinkers of the past. Machiavelli made the distinction between the prince and the people, between the palazzo, the prince's palace, and the piazza del popolo, that is to say, the streets or the public place of the people, of average citizens who talked but who did not act. Only the prince acted. So this realist, elitist model is rejected by Rosenau. The realist depiction of ignorant, indifferent individuals is no longer the truth. Why? Because nowadays, according to Rosenau, more and more citizens, such as you and me, are interested in international politics. They are interested in analyzing themselves, what is occurring beyond their borders. And what's more, they are no longer passive. They are active. That is to say, they want to intervene directly on the world political stage in order to try to change what they disagree with. This qualitative change is due to some long-term trends, such as the rise of education, middle-class education, the improvement of living standards, of course, the emergence of new means of mass communication. Internet did not yet exist in 1989, but television and other media, of course, did exist. So more and more people are better informed on what happens beyond their borders. So they are more likely to be interested in these events and therefore are likely to commit themselves in order to try to have themselves an impact on what is happening. That is to say, we assist at what Rosenau calls the rise of skillful individuals, or he also uses the term of powerful people. And the German citizens tearing down the Berlin Wall were powerful citizens. They put an end to the Eastern German regime and even to the Cold War to some extent, where they contributed to the end of the Cold War. Powerful people, skillful individuals then are likely to be more and more important on the world political scene. Of course, not everybody, according to Rosenau, not every average citizen is likely to become a Greenpeace activist, an Amnesty International activist. Not everybody is eager to risk their life. And he gives the example of a German citizen, Matthias Rust, who in the second half of the 1980s, what did he do? He took his twin-engined plane and flew to Moscow. He ran the risk of being shot down, of course. He was lucky he was not shot down. He flew to Moscow in order to promote peace. Just imagine. So this is a perfect example of a skillful individual. Not all of us are likely to become that courageous, skillful individuals. But though there are apathetic individuals, though there are egoistic individuals, though there are ideological individuals, there are democratic, skillful individuals too, eager to improve the world we are living in, because they are conscious that what happens somewhere will have an impact upon their own life. So there are different kinds of skillful individuals. Not all are pretty sympathetic. If we take the example of Mohammed Atta, he who was the pilot of the first plane, the first hijacked plane hitting the World Trade Center during the 9/11 attacks, from our Western point of view, is anything but sympathetic, of course. But sympathetic or not, these skillful individuals are likely to have an impact upon the world political or the post-international political scene. We can no longer ignore them. And this is all the more the case since the rise of skillful individuals will have an impact on the second or relational parameter, the micro-macro. If more and more citizens or individuals are likely to commit themselves on the international scene, then by definition, they no longer accept what their governments, their national governments, are telling them or are doing. Once again, there is a change that is occurring. In the past, the majority of citizens agreed with the following phrase: right or wrong, it's my country. That is to say, the nationalist or citizen allegiance was automatic. This is no longer true. There are new loyalties. You can be a French citizen and also a member of Greenpeace. You can be a Japanese citizen and a member of Greenpeace, and therefore criticizing Japanese whalers who go on fishing whales despite the risk for biodiversity, etc., etc. You can be a French citizen, but also be a Muslim, and consider that the Islamic Ummah community is more important than the French state. So there is a shift, according to Rosenau, a shift from national citizen allegiances or loyalties to extra-national, to extra-territorial, to transnational, to supranational loyalties. A citizen, an individual, is territorially located as a citizen, but also socially as a member of a non-state organization, be it an NGO, be it an ethnic group, be it a transnational political union or party, being a diaspora, be it a lesbian gay movement, etc., etc. New spheres of authority, in other words, emerge. The states are no longer the only spheres of authority. And we thus come to the third level, or the third parameter, the macro political parameter relative to the system-wide structure of the international system. If more and more individuals are skillful and are loyal no more exclusively to their nation state, but to non-state actors of various kinds, be they subnational communitarian groups or potentially supranational organizations. If this is true, then the world is gradually bifurcated. That is to say, we should distinguish the traditional state-centric world composed by states, which goes on existing, of course, and the multi-centric world composed by non-state actors, that is to say, sovereignty-free actors. States go on being eager to defend their borders, and to defend their sovereignty, to emphasize non-interference. But non-state actors try to bypass borders. They try to get rid of sovereignty. They promote suprastate global interests. They no longer respect the non-interference principle. When NGOs intervene in other states, they practice non-interference. When multinational firms invest in different states, they profit from the different fiscal legal systems in the different states. So they bypass the sovereignty of those states, including if the state is the state where they are originating from, in favor of other states. So they no longer listen to what the governments tell, they bypass the sovereignty. So the world is bifurcated in a state-centric and a multi-centric world. This world, of course, is bifurcated analytically speaking, but in the reality, the two half worlds, if you can use these expressions, are not juxtaposed to one another. They are interacting with one another. That is to say, they form a mixed world. We are living in a mixed world, which is all at once integrated or globalized on the one hand, and fragmented or localized on the other hand. Therefore, the traditional diplomatic governance put forward, put into practice, implemented by states does no more work. Because precisely of the different non-state actors who are driven by different values, identity, well-being, the future of the planet, rather than by sovereignty, territory, integrity or security, etc., etc. If then the traditional diplomatic resolution, means of resolution among states within international organizations during international intergovernmental summits, if this way of regulation no longer works, we have to invent a new form of global governance, a new form of global governance associating state actors, international organizations, and private or non-state actors. To some extent, then, ladies and gentlemen, James Rosenau is a kind of anticipatory spokesperson of your generations, today's students' generations, Greta Thunberg, who embodies this new kind of global governance model. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for attending today's lecture. Have a great day. See you again next week for our chapter 7. Goodbye.